February 24th, 2022, Russian invasion of Ukraine. October 7th, 2023, Hamas, attacking Israel. And these are just the two start dates of the many conflicts, big and small, going on around the world as we speak. It seems that there has been a shift in the world dynamics with a number of countries facing precarious situations. And even here in South Korea, we stand vigilant as calculated diplomatic moves are being taken worldwide. This is definitely an era where things are changing, and we should be thinking about how Korea should survive in this rapidly changing world. To gain further insight into all of this, we have invited Professor Park No-ja. You may know him already as such or as Vladimir Tikhonov, author of 전쟁 이후의 세계. He's professor of Korean Studies in the Department of Culture Studies and Oriental Languages at the University of Oslo. Although born in the Soviet Union, he immigrated to South Korea in 1997 and became a naturalized citizen in 2001. Let's welcome the professor back to our program. It's been like about a decade, I think. So let's say hi to him. Hi, Professor. Welcome back to the program.
Thank you so much for having me now in 10 years, as you have said.
Yes, absolutely.
And by the way, a Russian invasion of Ukraine began approximately 10 years ago. So anyway,
yes. With Crimea and going forward from there, yes. Well, I see that you're in Oslo right now, Professor. So maybe you can give us an update. How have you been? What have you been up to?
Well, I have been visiting Korea pretty often. Couldn't visit Russia for the last 5 years for the understandable reasons. Well, otherwise, and last years, you see, originally I'm supposed to do history, but as you have already mentioned, last couple of years, I also have been writing about the time which we are unfortunately facing now.
Yes. Well, let's jump right in, Professor. How has war shaped modernity, the modern world? What do you think, whether it's politically or economically?
Well, technologically, it's very obvious. Now we are talking with you using internet, and you perhaps remember that internet originated as APRANET, which basically was a network binding together military scientists. And it existed since the early 1970s, was commercialized in the late 1980s. So obviously we are dealing with originally military-industrial complex invention, which was later commercialized for civil use. And most inventions we are dealing with in our life are like this, I will tell you. And more generally, war was indispensable in shaping modern capitalist economy from the very beginning. You can remember that British industrialization was sped up by Napoleonic wars and prodigious amount of military order. And America only got over a Great Depression thanks to a Great War, World War II, and after that, Korean War, by the way. So obviously, we are dealing with something that is unfortunately very normal for capitalist world system.
Yes. So succinctly put. In your book, you discuss the profound transformations that occur worldwide in the aftermath of war. Could you elaborate on this idea, please?
Well, I was writing about so-called hegemonic cycles in the history of the world system. Usually, for a century or so, you have a hegemon, the strongest capitalist power in control of trade. And between the hegemonic cycles, between, say, Dutch hegemony and British hegemony, and then British and American hegemony, you usually have a period of warfare and chaos. So to say, interregnum, as we call it. So I was trying to understand whether we are dealing now with a hegemonic interregnum, as American hegemony is in obvious decline. And of course, it's a big question of what is going to come instead of it.
I see. Well, in your opinion, Professor, where is the world heading in this so-called post-war era? Because, we're supposed to be post-war, but we're seeing these modern day war happenings as we speak. And maybe you can add how you foresee it changing also?
Well, what I see is that first and foremost, we are not going to have a post-war era anytime soon.
Ah.
It looks as if the current period of the hegemonic interaction with gradual weakening of American hegemony and gradual rise of the challenges to this hegemony. It looks like this period of struggle for better positions in the world pecking order. This period is going to take a while, maybe 10, 15, 20 years. It may be quite long. The previous interregnum actually was the period between 1914 and 1945 was the previous hegemonic interregnum. So it can take a while.
Yes.
So it's very hard to predict what is going to happen after that. Most likely we are going to have, rather than a single hegemon, we are going to have several hegemonic centers, which would be dividing more or less the world, controlling their own spheres of influence, but they are going to be very much interconnected.
So not just one now, but several, as you say. We could feel your concerns about the state of the world in your writings. How can we navigate this era without war? Is there a way?
Well, you see, we had previous wars there, World War I and II, and those states that prospered most, for example, Sweden in Europe, after the World War II, it became the model social democratic welfare state. And one reason for its prosperity, obviously, was the fact that it didn't fight in either of the world wars. So you had other examples of the states which stood away from fighting, like Portugal, and they benefited enormously from that. So it depends, of course, on how your country is positioned in the world system. But one can at least make some efforts not to get entangled in one of those many conflicts that are going to happen in this period of hegemonic interaction. So one can at least try to avoid entanglements. And I think that's what South Korea perhaps has tried to do for its own good.
Yes, indeed. And, speaking of South Korea, obviously not an official declaration to the end of war, even for the Korean War. However, setting that aside, how should Korea survive in this rapidly changing world where, as you say, the dynamics are quite shifting? There isn't just one huge superpower, yet rather several.
Well, for one thing we should never do is we should not moralize international politics. Basically, great powers have very little to do with ethics or morals. And it doesn't matter in this case whether they are formally democratic or authoritarian. When it comes to great powers, they usually tend to use massive violence on huge scale, which entails human rights violations. And that happens even with democratic great powers, as we know very well from modern and contemporary history. If you look into Korean War, Vietnam War, it's very obvious. For one thing, we should not make what is happening now into a morality play. It's not. So another thing is that we have to understand that this situation is not going to change in that People's Republic of China is going to become stronger in the coming decade, perhaps coming decades. Its political system is not going to change, most likely. And it's very unlikely that our problematic neighbor, North Korea, will either disappear or significantly change its political system.
Yes.
The chances, or biggest probability is that it will be business as usual. It's going to be heavily armed state with this sort of bureaucratized personal rule by the current. So I don't see much possibility of it changing. So, and since the circumstances around us are not going to change, we have to adapt. That's it.
Adapt. Well, how can we adapt when we sometimes, South Korea, find ourselves in tough situation. We have our traditional allies, and then we have, regional powers. And even with the situation with North Korea, trying to balance these relationships, for example, the U.S., China, and even Russia, it's pretty tough.
Well, it's tough, of course, but we don't have to make the mistakes which we are making now. One big mistake which the current government, unfortunately, is making is they neglect completely the existence of North Korea per se. And they do it at their own peril. Because North Korea, as I have said, is not going to disappear. And recently, it looks like it's becoming stronger since it found its own niche in the era of war as an arms supplier to Russia.
Yes.
So it's getting rewarded for that. It looks like it helps it in a way to overcome some of its economic difficulties. It may help it to arm itself even better than it's already armed. And we may be heading for serious trouble unless we can find some sort of contact with the northern neighbor and understand how we can coexist peacefully.
Well, it's not just, warfare with weapons that we have to worry about. We have climate change, we have cybersecurity threats, we have global pandemics even, among the many challenges facing the post-war world. How can not just South Korea, but just countries generally coordinate their responses to any of these multifaceted, multipolar issues that exist?
Well, they should be wise enough. And what they should do, unfortunately, they don't. They should distinguish between politics and the issues of humanity's survival, like climate change. For example, in politics, you can have confrontation with China and Russia, and that's okay. It happens. But when it comes to climate change, we are going to equally suffer from that, and Korea is suffering already. You see the prices for vegetables and fruits in Korea, outrageous prices, and one reason for that is climate change, because we have much more climate disasters now in Korea than before. It affects the prices for apples and other things that are politically important, like onions. So we are already suffering from climate change. The thing is that Russia and China are among the biggest emitters of the climate gases. And you cannot change this fact. So what you have to do is that you can confront them, you can compete with them, you can even have proxy war with them. But on climate change, we have to collaborate. Unfortunately, it doesn't look as if it's happening this way, which is very, very sad.
Yes, yes. Collaboration is going to be key from here on out, obviously. Well, here's hoping that the powers that be are listening to what you're saying, Professor. But, I want to thank you so much for coming on air with us. Any last words for our listeners who very much may know you, Professor? What would you like to say?
Well, I hope that you enjoy Busan in spring and now basically in summer. And I sincerely wish that the summer wouldn't be too tropically hot. But as climate changes are making their way, I'm really, really afraid for Korean summers. They may really get wild. The tendency is that we have more and more tropical summers.
Yes.
So let's hope we avoid this time, but we really have to work with this. And we have to work all together. You see, you can't prevent climate changes by efforts of Koreans only.
Well, thank you so much. Take care, and hopefully we'll speak to you real soon again, Professor. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
And this was our special interview with Professor Park No-da, also known as Vladimir Tikhonov. And once again, we were talking about not just his opinions, but also his writings in 전쟁 이후의 세계.